And we are jump-starting a new week of Take Two with Jerry and Debbie on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. I'm Jerry Usher, along with my good friend, colleague, sister in Christ, co-host, Debbie Georgiani. I could go on, Debbie, but how you doing?
Oh, I was enjoying that introduction. I like that. I'm doing well, Jerry. Thank you so much. This subject today, Christians in the crosshairs. I mean, this is really got I don't know. I got my adrenaline is kind of flowing. I'm feeling kind of anxious because I was looking up I was doing some of the research on it, Jerry, and it's kind of making me kind of angry. So I'm really hoping that today I can find some peace with this, because to think that our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ are just living in such, just trepidatious and nervous conditions that at any time their lives and their families could be, attacked or persecuted. And this is going on all around the world. Boy, this is a subject, it's funny because living here in America, we don't, we read things in the paper or see it on the news, Jerry, but are we really experiencing it? No, I think sometimes our biggest concern is what we're going to have for dinner this evening, or, how we're going to get our car fixed in a couple days. We're not thinking persecution. And this really is a very deep subject today.
Yeah, we want your takes on this. Christians in the crosshairs. And basically, here's a little snapshot of what we're going to be talking about. And we have Carl Olson, who will join us here in just a minute to help us. But and I think, Debbie, our sense, dear listeners, is that anytime a conflict, a war, an intervention takes place around the world, seems like all of a sudden that leads to the persecution, as Debbie said, of our brothers and sisters, Christians around the world. They are dispersed, they're scattered, families are broken apart. There's, of course, rape and torture and murder. And we just want your takes on this. Do you pay attention to this? Do you care? Do you have that fire inside of you that says, "Dear God, what can we do to stop this?" There's, maybe we can't go over to these places and be right in the middle of it directly about it, but we can pray. Is our government doing enough? Is our government maybe helping to cause this problem? These are the questions we put to you, our listeners, right now at 1-800-585-9396. 1-800-585-9396. Debbie, did you have anything else before we bring Carl in?
No, I was just thinking when you said, praying and really, is our government doing enough? I go back to the show, Jerry, that we did on the power of the Most Holy Rosary. I mean, we really do have to band together, especially in the United States of America, and pray the Rosary continuously for our brothers and sisters all around the world that are being tormented and persecuted and being pushed into hiding. I can't even imagine that. I can't imagine walking out of my house not being able to wear a cross or a crucifix. I mean, this is really, we're in very serious times. So, yeah, I'm really, looking forward to seeing how this show evolves, Jerry.
All right, 1-800-585-9396. Another thing for our listeners, you to think about is, do we have to be concerned that in the near future things that are happening elsewhere in the world could be happening on U.S. soil? Or are we already being persecuted? I think we are in some ways, but just the fear of physical, abuse and torture just for simply being a Christian. 800-585-9396. We have Carl Olson with us. He's the editor of IgnatiusInsight.com and also Catholic World Report. He is the author or co-author of a number of books. You remember the movie The Da Vinci Code? He and Sandra wrote The Da Vinci Hoax, exposing the errors in the Da Vinci Code. Carl actually grew up a devout fundamentalist in Montana, became a convert to the Catholic faith, and in 2000 graduated from the University of Dallas with a master's in theological studies. He's been a director of catechesis and evangelization for his parish, and he is also the author of the study guide for Father Robert Barron's acclaimed Catholicism video series. So, Carl Olson, great to have you with us on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie. How are you?
Good, thanks, Jerry and Debbie. Great to be with you.
figured
Oh,
that.
go ahead.
Go ahead, Deb. No,
Well,
you.
I'm so excited to have Carl. I have a list of things I wanted to ask him. Real quickly, Carl, I mean, can you, in a nutshell, why is this happening? I mean, in this day and age, to hear that our brothers and sisters who believe the gospel message of Jesus Christ are having their heads, chopped off, women being raped, families being torn apart. How are we allowing this to happen? It is mind-blowing.
Well, I think part of the answer is historical. When you go back to the very beginnings of the church, the founding and establishment of the church by Christ, right from the start there was opposition. And in fact, right now I'm currently leading a Bible study at my parish through Acts of the Apostles, and we're towards the end now. And you see and of course, Acts of the Apostles takes place beginning in the 40s, in the first century, and going into the 50s. And you see Peter and Paul and other apostles being persecuted. We know that all of the apostles, with the exception of St. John, were martyred for their faith right from the beginning. And so that historical perspective, I think, as a Catholic, as a Christian, is very important, that we understand there's always going to be persecution, and it's going to take different forms. Sometimes it's going to be in a form that's very violent and even deadly, as obviously is taking place in many in the Middle East, in places like North Korea, which is the worst country in the world. And it's going to take more too. You actually see a more subtle form sometimes in the Acts of the Apostles, where it's more about social pressure. It's about kind of a social coercion, not so much that you're worried about being physically thrown into jail or being killed, but that you're basically kind of isolated or pushed to the fringes of society. And so I think that's something that we have to consider, more in the West. And then all through church history, there's been a lot of persecution of Christians, and obviously there's been different conflicts between religions, and certainly you have these historical events like the Crusades, which of course are very misunderstood, but you had things happen on both sides, but essentially you had, right there in the Crusades, you had this push by Christians to push back against the Islam. And Islam is the main culprit, radical Islam. And really, I would argue personally that inherent in the very nature of Islam, even though certainly not all of Islam is violent, that it's part of its very nature historically and philosophically. And that is what you see when you look at the top, 20, 30 countries that are engaged to be the most highly persecuted in terms of Christians being persecuted. Those are predominantly 40 out of 50, something like that, are countries that are Islamic in some way. You have some exceptions. I mentioned North Korea, which North Korea is we could talk about that, but it's very surreal, the things that go on there. And then you have places like, obviously, China, where there's actually been some improvements in recent decades, but it's still pretty bad. So the historical perspective, I think, is important. But then you look at, what animates these various groups. We talk about ISIS and Al-Qaeda and certain groups, what animates them. And I think Pope Benedict really nailed it in his Regensburg address. And he talked about when you have a distorted understanding of God, when you have a distorted understanding of man's relationship with God, you have a distorted understanding of the nature of religion, then it leads to this kind of persecution and violence. And I think so we have to really dig into the philosophical and ideological core of some of these beliefs in order to better appreciate what's happening.
Carl Olson with us on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie. What is your take on Christians in the crosshairs, our suffering brothers and sisters? World 1-800-585-9396. Carl, we've got to get to a break here in a minute, but what is it that sets North Korea apart and makes it sort of the biggest culprit out there?
Well, I don't mean to sound flippant, but when you read the stories about the way things have been there historically since the 1950s and 60s, it's almost cartoonish, in a really bad way. Basically, for decades now, as far as people can tell, there's absolutely no, there's no Catholic priests, there's no clergy of any sort in North Korea. That country, for over 40 years, has systematically sought to destroy religion religion, not just Christianity, but to completely destroy it. And so the number of practicing Catholics now, they estimate, it's very hard to tell, of course, is less than 1,000 in a country of 25 million, I think, something like that, maybe more. And it's just a systematic way. And then people who have escaped from North Korea, they say that their understanding of divinity is such that when people talk about God or some kind of a higher being, North Koreans don't think of something that's other, that's of this the world. They think of their leader. They think of the president, the benevolent dictator. They've been so brainwashed that their sense of deity is the leader of North Korea. It's astounding. So it's a really remarkable situation in this country where there's been a complete eradication of any kind of religious belief, and it's horrific. I mean, the kind of the killing of thousands, tens of thousands of people, of working them to death and so forth. And of course, we saw this too on a large scale with communism in the Soviet Union and China. But North Korea right now is really, unfortunately, leading the way in this really horrific approach to persecuting religious believers.
Right. Well, Carl, with that, I think we're going to go ahead and take a break. I got to let my blood pressure calm down a little bit for a few seconds while we take the break. And we're so glad you're with us. Carl Olson is with us the whole entire hour, and the phone lines are lighting up and filling up, and that's good. But there's room for you at 1-800-585-9396. That's 1-800-585-9396. You can be on the air and take two with Jerry and Debbie and Carl Olson. We'll be right back. Stay with us. We're going to take a quick break.
"60 Seconds" with Mother Angelica.
You know, you can be too generous. For example, if a man comes home with his paycheck and say he's just got $100, he's got 5 children, he's got rent, gas, and electric to pay, and he sees a poor man and he gives him the whole $100. And you say, oh, God's going to reward him. But see, the gas and electric company aren't going to think that way. That man was too generous. Now you say, well, how could he be too generous? He has his family to think about. He has his rent to pay. These are just debts and just obligations. Now he could have given part of that, but to throw away all of it is to use a virtue to an excess. Now you can do that with virtues. You can do that with any good thing.
The people you know and trust are on EWTN.
And we're set to go to your phone calls on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie on EWTN. Tomorrow, a bit of a related broadcast, Faith in Foxholes. We're going to have my good friend and former seminary classmate, Father Martin King, on the program. He was co-sponsored by the Archdiocese of Portland, Diocese for the Military Services, and we're going to talk about the faith of men and women in the military and how that helps to shape them and sustain them and strengthen them, and how we, as their family members and brothers and sisters and neighbors and co-workers, can be praying for them and supporting them spiritually. So that's tomorrow on Take Two with Jerry. Today we're talking about Christians in the crosshairs. Our brothers and sisters are really up against it in some places around the world. Is that even coming to our shores at some point? Well, God only knows that, but we're going to start your phone calls with JD, who is in Biloxi, Mississippi, listening on Catholic Community Radio. JD, welcome to Take Two with Jerry and Debbie, and we have Carl Olson. How are you?
I'm doing well. I couldn't help but hear your question. Is anybody out there paying attention? Does anybody care? And the answer is unequivocally and resoundingly yes. I pay attention to the extreme. I read daily of these attacks. It hits me viscerally. I'm absolutely outraged, disgusted, and have very seriously considered going over there to help fight against ISIS and the persecution to defend Christians who are there. There's a group, Lions of Rajah. You may have heard of them. They're in Kurdistan, and they are actively engaging and recruiting foreigners, anybody who will help to fight against ISIS. There's another group as well. These guys are not getting the attention. We had an American, little-known fact, who died pretty recently fighting ISIS. He was from Massachusetts, and he came home sort of an unsung hero fighting to defend Christians. We're not getting, once again, I'm blaming and faulting the so-called shepherds who have dropped the ball. We're not seeing it in the defense of in utero Americans who are dying daily. We're not seeing it in defense of Christians around. These are the people who have been selected to lead us, and they're dropping the ball. I'm ready to go. We're ready to fight. We're ready to have another crusades, and the leaders are not there for us.
JD, you got some passionate thoughts. Carl, I'd love your reaction to what JD is saying.
Well, I love the passion, too, and I think, the thing that comes to mind here is just I agree that we, and I wouldn't just include our shepherds. I mean, I would speak for myself as well. Even though I work as the head of a Catholic news journal, it's something that you see. You see the news briefs and you see the stories, and it hits you, and then you move on to the next thing. It's hard sometimes to remain focused on because it's so overwhelming. I think that's the thing when you look at it and you start looking at the various countries. The fact that there's dozens of countries, and if you look at a map, people can find maps online if they do a search for Christian persecution. And the maps show, large sections of northern Africa, and of course the Middle East, and places like obviously we mentioned North Korea and down into the Indonesia and so forth, and dozens of countries where people are being persecuted and killed. And so it's so overwhelming, and it becomes almost too much. So I think first of all, we have to spend time praying. I mean, the very least we can do, and it's certainly not small, but the very least we should do, and we certainly do it every Sunday at Mass, I would hope, but every day of the week, hopefully, pray for our persecuted brothers and sisters, and then start looking for ways that we can help, big or small, whether it's through money, through supporting groups that help refugees, through groups that are helping bring awareness. There are obviously a lot of, there's groups like Voice of the Martyrs, and other groups that are spreading the news and have information out there. So I think educating ourselves about what's really happening, and then I come back, personally, something I mentioned earlier, which is, and this is something I would really fault a lot of our political and Catholic leaders on, frankly, and that is we continue to refuse to address the real problem, which is the nature of Islam. And again, I'll reiterate, not all of Islam is violent. But when you look at the countries and you look at the vast majority of persecution of Christians comes from groups that are predominantly Islamic, and the groups that we're dealing with obviously are Islamic. And so I think the whole idea that we talk about, well, this is a perversion of Islam, this is something that I've seen various church leaders and political leaders say, well, Islam, even Pope Francis said, well, Islam by its very nature is peaceful. These are perversions of Islam. Personally, speaking for myself, I disagree with that. I think that when you look at the history of Islam, when you look at the way that it's operated, that it has within it an ambiguity. And the ambiguity is one in which Muslims know that the violence, that the persecution, the Sharia law, all these things are part of the religion, and that they cannot really speak out against it. I mean, the vast majority of Muslims do not speak out against it. There are some exceptions. Really, we talk about as moderate Islam. Muslims would say, well, that's not true Islam. That historically, Father Samir, who's a Jesuit and has written a number of books on Islam, has made the point that the vast majority of Muslims are not violent, but they know they cannot really criticize or condemn those Muslims who decide to take up acts of terrorism and to persecute and to kill, because they know that's a legitimate interpretation of the Quran. That's a legitimate way to live Islam. And I personally wish that our leaders would speak more directly about this. Now, that doesn't mean there's an easy solution to that, but I think we have to stare at the facts very clearly. And so part of what's happening is that we're not addressing and looking at the situation clearly and what the reasons are for it, and that means it just kind of continues. and without being really addressed. And that's kind of my passionate part here is I wish we would be more open about what's really going on and what's driving it.
Carl, you definitely summed that up perfectly. I too share JD's passion and even the sense of urgency that we have to do something. But you are completely correct. I mean, we know this in the simplest of things. If you don't name it exactly what it is, you can't address it or refute it or attack it. When you dance around exactly what it is, everybody's going, well, maybe it is this, maybe it's not, maybe it's something else. That's where all that chaos comes into play. We have to be honest and direct. Now, but Carl, I have to ask you this. This is very interesting because I was looking on the stats about Christians and persecutions around the world. And maybe this might help JD because it actually made me kind of really feel somewhat, I understood it better. Christians in general, and we're talking about, Catholics and Pentecostals and evangelicals, Christians together, we tend to reject violence and retribution and vengeance, and we're more peaceful people. So, I mean, obviously, just from like you look at the schoolyard bullies, we're going to get picked on. Am I right in thinking on this?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. That's entirely correct. And when you look at historically, you look at Christianity, that has often been the case. Now, we shouldn't ignore, of course, historically clear examples where engaged military actions and have been aggressive. And, of course, there's always necessary context to that. Sometimes the Crusades are kind of thrown out there like they're somehow the equivalent to modern-day terrorism, and that's completely, inaccurate and unfair. But Christianity has always had a deep core of, like you say, tolerance, but also kind of a passive or a peaceful approach to interaction with others. There's a difference between evangelizing and coercing people, proselytizing in a violent manner. And I think Christianity historically has embraced that end of it. There's always been exceptions. There's been people, bad Christians, bad Catholics, absolutely. Whereas in Islam, the core of it has always been, since Muhammad had his second round of revelations, to be aggressive and coercive and violent in making people Muslim. Huge difference. And so Christianity has suffered in that regard.
JD, we've got to get to a break in less than 2 minutes. Any final thoughts on what we've been saying? I don't know, maybe, JD, you're still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Yeah, if you got about 30 seconds if you've got any follow-up comments, because we do have to get to a hard break here.
I thought it was extremely interesting. I researched, and you can find it on the net very easily. The Pope's Swiss Guard, the body men around him are actually carrying under their suits the H&K MP7, the same automatic weapon used by the Navy SEALs. It shows that even the Holy Father sees the need for automatic weapons and defense and fighting.
Well, I was not aware of that. That certainly may be the case, and it might be well warranted too. I've in my own mind and heart, a day going to come when we should have, at the very least, like they do on airplanes with the what do you call them? The guys who fly with guns. You don't know who they are.
Yeah,
the marshals.
Yeah. I've often thought, maybe the time is coming. You look at what's happening in churches and so forth. They're just being attacked, bombed, guns. When is that first incident like that going to happen in the United States? And, if I were a pastor of a parish, would I do something to be prepared for that? I don't know. I mean, these are questions we're asking. We're taking your phone calls. JD, thanks. As you can hear, we got to get to the break. Carl Olson is with us on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie. Appreciate the patience of those of you on hold. We will get to you at 1-800-585-9396. Stay with us.
I don't have money to travel, but I can travel the world on EWTN, and I do. God bless each of you. I love traveling the world on EWTN.
If you have a comment about our programming, we'd love to hear from you too. Call 205-795-5773 or send us an email to radio@EWTN.com. Thank you very much for listening. God bless you.
Think of all the media our young people are exposed to today. MTV, movies, what passes for entertainment on TV, song lyrics that are questionable or worse. Where do they hear the message that it's okay to be chaste and modest, or that it's not crazy to practice their faith, or to believe in a God who loves them and can forgive them no matter what they do? Catholic Radio is the answer. Be sure to tell your friends and relatives about the positive programming that you hear here on Catholic Radio.
Hi, this is Joan Lewis. In my work here at the Vatican, I'm blessed to speak with all kinds of people every day, from visitors to Rome, to Vatican officials, even to the Pope. And every week on our EWTN program, Vatican Insider, I'll share with you. We'll bring you the latest news from Rome. We'll talk with Vatican leaders and newsmakers, and we'll answer your questions. So don't miss Vatican Insider this weekend, right here on the EWTN Radio Network. For times in your area, go to EWTN.com and click on radio.
Hear what others are saying about listening to EWTN Radio.
I bought Sirius Radio because I travel a lot, and I saw they had 3 Christian stations and realized 2 of them were Catholic. Being a Protestant, I thought, oh boy, but I really appreciate it. I appreciated what I've heard today and what I've learned.
I hope you'll keep listening to EWTN in particular and continue enjoying our programs.
I'm going to.
Listen daily to the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Welcome back, dear friends, to Take Two with Jerry and Debbie. Today we're talking about Christians in the crosshairs. Tomorrow's show is going to be Faith in Foxhole, so we're going to kind of continue it on with a little bit different angle. But today the phone lines are indeed filled up, but we might be able to squeak one in just for you. 1-800-585-9396. Our guest today is Carl Olson, and he is sharing with us his experience and his knowledge about this subject, about persecution and Christians. And we're going to move right along because Matthew in Indiana has been waiting. I sure hope, Matthew, that you're listening on Sirius XM 130. You can hear the show, and welcome to Take Two with Jerry and Debbie and Carl.
Oh, thank you for taking my call. it's a great show, and I wanted to just enter the conversation on a little bit of my own personal experience. What I've seen in like the social media and what you see, in just our daily lives, you see this side and that side, and really the dynamic I want to talk about is when on the Christian side, the Christian perspective, you look at the media and see that the other side is in control. They're the ones that are pulling the strings, so they're not following what we would wish. And then you go on to the liberal side or the secular side of the world, and you realize they're the ones believing that we're in control, that we're pulling the strings. Now, if neither one of them are in control, then who is pulling the strings? That's like the first part for us with this. But it's like, this is where all the manipulation takes, because nobody's being represented at this point except for the ones in the middle. And you have to ask yourself, what is their agenda? What's the goal? What's the ambition that they're after? And, the result is the chaos that we have. Mm-hmm. You could trace that to the dark one. You could trace that to any avenue you wish to label it by, but it's still evil in its intent.
Carl, take it away.
Well, he touches on a point that I think I've had kind of a change of mentality about over the years, especially since I took over Catholic World Report about 3 years ago, and that is I don't think that there is such a thing as an objective, neutral media. It just it doesn't exist. There is truth. There's absolute truth. Obviously, I believe in objective truth, but I think that every single media story, even when it's supposedly called a hard news story, it comes from a certain worldview. It comes from a certain perspective, and it comes with certain assumptions. It has to, because you just can't. Obviously, if you were to detail at the beginning of every single news article, your philosophical understanding of everything, you'd end up with a book and not with a news article. And so you have to assume things. And I think what Matthew's touching on here is when we look at these things around the world, these events around the world, there can be what we might call a secular perspective, there can be a Catholic perspective or whatever. It doesn't mean that they're equally true or valid. It means that we have to be, first and foremost, we have to have our minds and hearts shaped by the church and by Jesus Christ, and to have a perspective that reflects that and is willing to look at the truth, even when it means examining, some ideas have that might be wrong about how the world works, about what's actually going on, or how we can actually do things better, or how we make choices. And so I think that what you find in the United States is you find a reluctance to really address these things and to speak out about what's happening to Christians around the world. There's exceptions to that. For instance, the New York Times, which, of course, is very secular, and I criticize the New York Times often, but the New York Times just last week ran a really good article about Christian persecution in the world and did a pretty good job with it, and that's very welcome. And you had a number of people pick up and talk about that and say, yeah, this is something that we need to be talking more about. Pope Francis has talked about it. People wish he talks about it more. I think he actually has been doing that in his own way. I think that it just comes back to stating things clearly, giving a lot of facts, obviously, but also through the prism, through the mind of the church. And to give example of what that means, I think at the end of the day, this persecution of Christians is the result of a spiritual battle. This is a spiritual battle between, Satan, who wishes to destroy the church, and, of course, our Lord Jesus Christ. And that going on for centuries and millennium. And so we have to look at it from that perspective, not simply through the perspective of politics. That'd be my second point here. When we see everything through the lens of just politics, I think things get distorted. And I think that's one of the problems, too, with things that are happening here in the West in terms of religious freedom and what Christians may or may not be able to do, and these various events like so-called gay marriage. Everything is shot through the prism of politics, when in reality what we're talking about are moral issues, cultural issues, spiritual issues. Issues at the end of the day have to do with what's right and wrong and what is good for people, known both through natural reason and through divine revelation. And so we have to see things from that perspective and be careful about seeing things instead just through the perspective of politics.
And Matthew, if I can just weigh in, we'll let you have another word in a second, but I pick up on what Carl was saying. This really is a question of truth. And we saw Jesus, who is, he is the truth embodied. He is the way, the truth, and the life. And Jesus was for the truth that he represented, and the Christians, of course, are what, or are who? We are the body of Christ. Mm-hmm. So that hatred of the truth that was manifested to the point of putting Jesus to death is probably, I would say almost certainly, never going absent from the world as we see it today. But it gets down to a question of truth. And Carl and Debbie, I look at that. You guys will know it well. Carl, you especially, living in Eugene, Oregon, that coexist bumper sticker. I look at that and I say, you know what? That is not metaphysically possible. It's like some people say 2 + 2 is 4, and somebody else says, no, for me it's 5. And it's like that bumper sticker is saying, oh, well, that's nice. I'm glad 2 + 2 for you is 5. It isn't metaphysically possible. There can only be one truth. It's a unified truth. And when some people, for whatever reason, don't see it, don't believe it, don't want to adhere to it, then that is going to lead to them ultimately getting violent, like we see in some cases. But Matthew, I don't know if any of what we just said gets at the points you were raising or not.
Oh, absolutely. I everything was just right dead on. I mean, the point does, there are organizations out there in the world, and, from the Catholic perspective, in a lot of cases, and again, it's probably rightfully so, that we're told not to pay attention to these things, to turn away, to be, watch what we watch and listen, what we listen to. But if we don't know what's going on the other side, they're going to run amok. And I'm telling from my own conversion, from where I come from, I know some of these organizations, And they are serious. They are dead serious about what they're doing, and in some cases, they're even unaware of what it is that they're following. And in the end of it, it's lies. It's those lies that make people manipulate. It manipulates them and makes them do things that they otherwise, in a Christian perspective, they would never even come close to. But this is that middle ground that I'm talking about, and he definitely did touch on that. But that's where the manipulation is in the world, and I think there's so much that could be more that could be said. And I try to use a little bit of philosophy and when I look at social media, not everything's true, and undoubtedly there's an enormous amount of stories that are just completely idiotic in their best, but there is some craziness truth out there. There is some truth that there are these organizations that are doing these things. So, it's not so much let's take the blinders off and start looking at things that are going to lead us down a wrong road. But is there in the church, organizations that pay attention to these things? Because these are the people that are starting to grow in numbers. These are the ones that are starting to influence the world around them. And again, ask yourself a question. How many politicians are Catholic? How many politicians do we know, even on a local level, are Catholic? Getting to the real pulse of America, like where this is going. We're going to end up with this thing if we don't start getting involved like that.
Well, Matthew...
I think Matthew touched on something that is directly related to this issue of the attraction that Islam holds for certain people in the West, especially certain young men. And we all know the stories about, some middle-class kid raised in the West, and then, at the age of 24, for some reason, he suddenly, goes off to the Middle East and joins a group. And there's a sensational factor to that, but the fact is there really is an undeniable attraction for certain people. Well, why is that? Well, I think at the end of the day, one of the reasons is that a lot of kids who are very sensitive to, I think, spiritual realities and to cultural realities, life they live, and they say, if this is it, I don't want to be a part of it. If this is all there is, and by that I mean kind of a secular way of living, where it's all about just here in the temporal realm, go to college, get a job. And I think some kids are saying, well, why? What is the ultimate point of the purpose of this? And so there's an attraction, there's a certain pathological attraction to something that is really dramatic and involves a complete embrace of a really radical perspective. And we recently ran a piece on Catholic World Report by Dr. James Patrick, which talked about the very same heart impetus at the very core of our being that drives, say, a St. Francis to be the incredible witness that he was, is the same deep urge that, when it becomes twisted and distorted, leads to some 26-year-old kid blowing himself up and trying to kill others. Because what he's saying is, he's going back to that ancient principle that even great acts of evil are perversely oriented towards some greater good. In other words, the kid who wants to give himself over to ISIS and to kill others for the cause of Allah is looking for something that's beyond just this material realm. We all want that. In Christianity, that's found in dying to ourselves, sacrificing ourselves for others through the grace of Christ, through the power of the Holy Spirit. Unfortunately, when that energy is directed into a distorted, perverted, pathological, quote-unquote, religion, it ends up in really horrific places. And I think that's what we're seeing. The fact is, secularism cannot satisfy the soul. It can't satisfy the soul, and it's going to lead to this. And I go back to Pope Benedict. I would urge everybody, if they've not read it or if they read it, go back and reread Pope Benedict's Regensburg Address, which a lot of people denounced as being insensitive and all this. It's actually incredibly brilliant. He totally nails it, that when you have a perverted understanding of God, a perverted understanding of God's relationship to man, bad things happen. And you see it not just in forms of Islam, you see it in the secular realm as well. But you see it in kind of a different way. Not so dramatic, but still very real.
Yeah. Matthew, thank you. Great contribution to Take Two with Jerry and Debbie. We appreciate that. 1-800-585-9396. We have Carl Olson on the program with us. Carl is the IgnatiusInsight.com and Catholic World Report. At the end of the program, we'll give you details on how you can get more information about those. He lives in Eugene, Oregon, with his wife Heather and their 3 children. And we're talking about Christians in the crosshairs, our brothers and sisters, how they always get the short straw, so to speak, but in a horrible, sometimes horrific, and even deadly way when there are wars, crises, interventions, things like this. Those of you on the whole, we are going to get to every one of you. We'll go to Christine next, who is listening in Ontario, Canada, on EWTN.com. Christine, welcome to Take Two with Jerry and Debbie.
Hello, how are you?
Fine. How are
Good,
you doing?
thank you.
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for taking my call. I had actually initially, I'd been thinking part of the reason why I'm aware of the plight of the Christians elsewhere is because I listen to Catholic radio, and in Canada we have very, very little exposure to anything, Christian and Catholic. The United States is, blessed in that. But the thought came to mind with the bishop from Nigeria, from Boko Haram. I believe he had a vision that if we all prayed the rosary, are you familiar with this?
I'm not placing it in remarks given in the last few weeks.
I'm not exactly sure. He basically, because of what's happening to the Christians, where they're being persecuted, and where the girls were kidnapped by
Right.
Boko Haram, who is now connected with ISIS. Are we familiar with this?
Oh yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And his call was for us to pray the rosary, and we talked about that at the beginning of the show about prayer, and I agree 100%. But I'm also old-fashioned in that I believe that united we stand, divided we fall. Yeah, if we're not all united in our prayer, to me the power of prayer, right? The more that pray. So sort of my question is how do we approach our bishops, throughout North America plus throughout the world, to potentially pray that rosary, so as that we do end up helping that bishop.
Bishops but there are, of course, in the United States at least, I know a lot of bishops who do encourage regular prayer for brothers and sisters around the world, and certainly an emphasis on the rosary, which has of course a really rich and incredible history of of being part of powerful interventions by God on behalf of Christians. And I think the great thing about the rosary in this context is that you see the glory and the joy, and then the suffering, the reality of the fact that Christianity is really about death and then resurrection. And so, God uses the power. God, but through His power, takes our prayers. And the wonderful thing about the communion of the saints, and this is something that to me is so beautiful about Catholicism, this understanding that God, my piddling little prayers, and He's able to use those through His in ways that I cannot imagine, I don't understand in this world. And so I think we need to really trust, obviously, in the power of the Holy Spirit to take what we can do, even if it's just prayer, and that He will use those who are suffering, in the Sudan or in Syria or Saudi Arabia, wherever they are. He will use that, and we won't know about that. We won't understand that until, by God's grace, we're on the other side. So, I totally agree that the Rosary is a great way to focus our minds and our hearts on those who are suffering. And as far as the bishops, just send them a letter or send them an email.
Yeah.
Say, this is what I think could help, something you should consider to do, and send that along, and see what happens.
And Carl, I just want to say, Christine, you definitely listen and EWTN and Catholic Radio, so thank you so much for that. You are right on, absolutely correct. The bishop in Nigeria had a vision of Christ, and was told to him to pray the rosary to stop Boko Haram. And so yes, so let's listen to the Nigerian bishop who's telling us that he got a word from God that the rosary is powerful, and it will work if we unite together and pray it daily. So Christine, thank you so much for your contribution. and yes, that's what we need to do. So we're definitely those words, and this is what's great about Take Two with Jerry and Debbie, is that our listeners, they love to respond. And so let's start together and start praying to stop this radical Islam that is moving across and just really terrorizing our brothers and sisters in Christ. So thank you, Christine, for your words. We're going to move right along to Margaret, listening in Portland, Oregon on Modern Day Radio. Hi, Margaret. You were the one I said was going to squeak in, and you did. I'm so proud of you. Hi, Margaret. Welcome with Jerry and Debbie. And Carl.
Hi.
Hi.
What I wanted to say is it's not incidental. Christians nonviolent. Jesus taught us that. He challenged us to love enemies. And, if there's one Catholic in North Korea, it's because somebody there responded to that terrible situation with love. I mean, that's how actually the race relations in our country have been changing, because Martin Luther King Jr. heard that nonviolent, and it works. When Jesus died, the apostles didn't take up arms to go get those Romans. I mean, that's a very natural, I understand that, really. Revenge and vengeance, that's how we react to everything that hurts us. But it isn't Jesus' way. And Jesus' way really works. I mean, look at it. We converted the Romans. Our headquarters is in Rome, the seat of the people that murdered Jesus. So I think, and
well,
the
Margaret,
rosary is, so that's a wonderful call. It does take a lot of courage. It's very hard to love our enemies.
Margaret, that is a great call. And Carl, I want your thoughts in a second, but it goes back to what was discussed a little bit early on in the show, Margaret. And I think, Carl, you were making the point, or either you or Debbie, that really this is one of the things that kind of opens Christians up to being treated like this, is because it's not our way. Jesus taught, turn the other cheek and so forth. Jesus also, though, he turned over the money changers' tables and so forth. So he had a proper balance of, if you can call it, anger, righteous anger and so forth. But we do, I think, tend to be more vulnerable to things like this. We are called to respond to violence with love. And I'm thinking of the shooting in South Carolina where the young boy, shot and killed the 9 people. And that, at least in the media, that event was completely diffused by the reaction of the survivors. They said, immediately, they said, we forgive, we love, with forgiveness and love. And that basically left well, now what do we say about that? They couldn't whip up any more, racial tension or try and, contrive anymore. And so, Carl, I want to give you time to respond to that, Carl. We've got about 3 minutes for you, and then we got to get ready to wrap up the show.
Well, I think there's a distinction to be made here. First of all, I totally agree with what Margaret said, and I think we should distinguish, though, between the individual witness of someone who willingly turns the other cheek and even might accept persecution and even martyrdom, and distinguish that from the duty that governments and states have to protect its citizens in a proper way. That I think that balance is important. When Constantine finally legalized Christianity in the early 300s, and then became, of course, a sponsor of sorts of Christianity and supported it, the Christians were ecstatic, and that's, of course, the beginning of how, or a major part of how the Christians took over Rome. It was through their endurance in being persecuted, being martyred. That's absolutely key. That's, the blood of the martyrs, we know is really the seed, provides the seed for the growth of the church. But then there's the fact that in the conversion is not just at the individual level. It begins there, but it also is at the cultural and social and even political level. So that governments and states should, in ways that are proper, that are just, that adhere to defending those who are vulnerable. I think that's a key part of it, too. And so, yes, if a person is in that situation and they say, I'm deciding that I'm going to turn the other cheek and I'm going to accept this, that's incredible. But I think states also have an absolute obligation to protect those who are defenseless, those who are, those families and cities and communities that need the defense of the state. And so, we enter into that political realm, that governmental realm. It's very difficult, and I think that's the great challenge now we face. How do countries like countries in the West address what's happening in the Middle East? I certainly don't have an answer to that. I would agree, though, however, a big part of it's going to begin at the level of individual witness. And the fact is it's estimated that there's over 100,000 Christians. This is from the Vatican. Over 100,000 Christians are killed every year because of their faith. And there's estimated that some 200 million Christians right now are being denied fundamental human rights because of their belief in Jesus Christ. So that's something to keep in mind. It's incredible numbers.
And women and children, they all deserve to feel at peace in their homes and to not have that feeling that at any moment their door could be busted down and they could be taken and ripped away from their families and, and God forbid raped. So I agree with you. Carl, I have to invite you again. Would you consider coming on to a future broadcast? Because I love the way you speak. I could listen to you all day long. I just want to put you on the spot so that yes.
I bet your wife says that all the time, right, Carl?
Well, my kids say that all the time. Well, thank you. Yeah, no, I'd be happy to be on your show. Absolutely.
Well, and I looked you up, Carl. So it's Carl Olson. Do you have a blog? Am I right? Do you have a blog? How can people find you?
I blog on the Catholic World Report site. My primary work is the Catholic World Report website. We have a feature almost every single day, plus additional sub-features and blog posts there. And so that's where I do a lot of my work. Yep.
Great.
All right, Catholic World Report is a publication of Ignatius Press. I heartily encourage all of our listeners to get a hold of that. But also, Carl, you are on IgnatiusInsight.com. What will people find there?
Well, that's kind of become kind of an aggregate website where we have a lot of things about what Ignatius Press is doing, but also some links to Catholic World Report, Homiletic and Pastoral Review, which is our sister publication, which focuses on ministry and pastoral issues, and then the Insight Scoop blog, where we have news about Ignatius Press books and releases and events and so forth.
All right, Carl, we're going to have to forgive me. We'll have to. Yeah, thank you so much. As you can tell from the music, we are out of time. Take two with Jerry and Debbie. Tomorrow, faith in foxholes, faith in the military. Be with us for Take Two with Jerry and Debbie tomorrow on EWTN. Until then, have a blessed day.